is finished. On a cold Tuesday afternoon on the 30th of January 1649 in England, a man was brought out to be executed before a watching crowd. And at 2 p.m, that man was executed by beheading for murder, treason, and other crimes. But no one stops to remember that man, and you probably don't even know his name. Yet today, we get a day off to remember someone else who was executed, Jesus. So let me start by asking today, why are you here? Why are you here? There's probably lots of different reasons. Someone invited me, it's the done thing, I'm not sure. Let me tell you why you're here. Because 2,000 years ago, a man, Jesus, died. He died on a Roman cross on the other side of the world. And because of that, our nation stops. And you get a day off work to come here. And we've come here to remember him. And while a man dying on a cross does sound quite strange to us, in those days it was actually quite commonplace. Thousands of people were killed on crosses. In fact, 2 other people were crucified on that same day. We don't remember them. So why are you here today? To remember that man, Jesus, and to believe in him. Not just to believe that he existed or really did die. Many people believe that, as we'll see. But to believe that he died on that cross for me. That it should be me there, but instead it was him. And now I am right with God forever. You see, many people do believe that Jesus died that day, but the difference about believing in Jesus is trusting in him to take what you deserve, to give you forgiveness and eternal life. And people say many things about what happened that day. Some say Jesus was just a good teacher, and this was all an unfortunate accident, that he was misunderstood and killed. But as we'll see in our first, Jesus never claimed that. He said he was the innocent king who was killed. It was no mistake. It was actually the last step in Jesus' master plan. In our first point, we'll see the cross was no mistake, the last step in Jesus' master plan. And secondly, we'll ask the question, but did it really happen? Because again, why are you here? If it didn't really happen, then there's no point being here. But if it did happen, then there's every point in being here. And finally, why did it happen? And what does it mean to you? We'll see that Jesus came to swap our wrong for his right, our sin for his life. And we'll ask, what does this mean for you? Our first point, the innocent king is killed. Now, there's a popular false belief that Jesus was just a nice guy who was misunderstood and killed. And we saw in that part of Jesus' biography of his life that we read before that couldn't be any further from the truth. No, Jesus is a king and an innocent king. But he's also a mocked king, and he's killed at a mock trial. And we're going to see those two things. Jesus really was innocent, and he really is king, but not the kind of king you'd expect. Let me set the scene for you. The setting is that Jesus has been touring around ancient Israel, and in that day they were under occupation by the mighty and cruel Roman Empire. For the past 70 years they had been ruled by Rome and extremely heavily taxed and oppressed by them. Yet Jesus had been going around healing people and performing incredible signs and claiming to be God's special king, the Saviour sent to save God's people. But the strange thing about him is he wasn't interested in political power at all. He doesn't try and raise an army. He doesn't try to storm the gates. No. Instead, he's interested in saving people from sin, in ending death. All the kind of being a good person stuff that the leaders of the day were talking about, it didn't help people at all. Jesus knew that what he was going to do, that would help people. And of course, the religious leaders of the time, they were threatened by Jesus. He was much more popular than them, and so they get Jesus arrested. But the catch is, they don't actually have the power legally to have him killed. So they bring Jesus to Pilate, the Roman overlord, and they try to twist Pilate's arm into killing Jesus. Now, Pilate, who we see there in that famous painting, he had a very simple objective. He was to keep the Jewish people under control. He was to get as much tax as possible out of them to send back to Rome, to keep his superiors happy, and then they'd make him very rich. He's kind of classic middle management. You might know middle management, that's kind of what he's trying to do. Keep the people below him down, keep the people above him happy. But what we see is that Jesus is really innocent. They hold a mock trial, and Pilate has already done a bit of a preliminary trial of Jesus and found him not guilty of these trumped up charges. But to keep the leaders happy, he's had Jesus beaten, and he brings him back to show him to them. And he says, "Here is the man, and I find no charge against him." But the leaders, they press Pilate all the more, don't they? Crucify him, they say. "Ah," says Pilate. And Pilate answered, "You take him and crucify him. But as for me, I find no basis for a charge against him." Jesus is innocent. It's not a fair trial. It's a mock trial. Pilate knows he's innocent. The leaders know he's innocent. They're trying to tell him that he's somehow this dangerous terrorist and he's about to kick out the Romans. And Pilate's like, what a joke. This guy, Jesus, is a joke. Pilate feels in no way threatened by Jesus. I mean, he's just had him taken off and beaten. All he did was talk about saving people from their sins. In fact, the Romans thought it was all a bit of a joke, really, and they mock Jesus. He has a mock trial, and now he's a mocked king. You see, for the Romans, they thought this was somewhere between kind of slightly annoying for Pilate and absolutely hilarious for the soldiers. Because the leaders were obviously just jealous of this harmless man. I mean, this Jesus guy doesn't even have an army. And it's a hilarious thought to think that this weak and helpless man was a king. Just like the Jews were weak and helpless, they thought. In fact, he actually made it quite a fitting king for these weak Jews, the Romans thought. And so the Romans mock this weak King Jesus, and we see that in verse 1. Those details, they put a crown of thorns on his head and they dress him in purple. What a king would wear, but a mock king. And the soldiers, they play dress-ups like children play dress-ups. The thing is, they're not playing. And they placed those spikes of the crown that were likely inches long on his head. And that purple robe, that sign of royalty. But Jesus just sport, a bit of game for the boys who were bored. The second thing we see is he's a mocked king. In verse 2, they say, "Hail," as you'd say to Caesar, but then they slap him in the face and all have a good laugh about it. You see, it's all a joke for them, but it's no joke for Jesus. How would you feel? How would you feel knowing that you were innocent? Isn't that everyone's worst nightmare, right? Don't you have that? I had that nightmare sometimes of being locked up for something that you haven't done, having people lied about you, all your friends desert you. I mean, where were Jesus' mates to give him a character witness? No, Jesus wouldn't do it. They'd all abandon him. You and I might imagine what that was like, but for Andrew Millard, he didn't have to imagine what that was like. In 1995, Andrew Millard was wrongly convicted for murder in Western Australia, and it was later shown that the police selectively used evidence to find him guilty. And it's just terrible to think of the injustice of that. Wouldn't you rail against that injustice if you were locked up unfairly? Well, Millard did. He railed against that for 12 years till he was finally released. Yet Jesus is also innocent, but he doesn't loudly proclaim his innocence. No, Jesus is strangely calm and strong. Pilate asks him, why? In verse 8, we see Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid. He brings him back inside the palace and he asks Jesus, "Where did you come from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. Pilate says, "Do you refuse to speak to me? Don't you realize I had the power either to free you or to crucify you?" And Jesus answered him, "You have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." We see Jesus, he's calm, he's measured. You see, Jesus is actually in control here. And the irony is, Pilate is not in control here, is he? We can see Pilate, he's being pushed around by the Jews. And the irony is that Jesus really is the king, the promised king of the Jews. Note, Jesus says that Pilate's power is only given to him from above, from God. You see, Jesus knows this was God's plan, his plan from the very beginning. And this was the plan. This is his coronation, his crowning as king. But oh, what a strange king. You know, when Queen Elizabeth II was crowned, it was planned to the second. It was broadcast on live TV. Everything was taken care of. And I'm sure when Charles is crowned as king, it'll be the same. They'll be sure to make sure there's maximum glory, maximum honor. And God has planned Jesus' coronation too. Even this moment of most rejection of God, even God's own people say, "We have no king but Caesar." Every salute, every hail, King of the Jews, you see the joke's on them. He was the King of the Jews. Even Pilate finally putting a sign over Jesus' head, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews," was God's plan all along. He uses their evil to make good. Jesus dies for the very people who hate him. That's why all those Old Testament prophecies keep getting mentioned throughout the passage. And note that the sign is in 3 languages: Aramaic, Latin, and Greek. God was not just saving his people. No, it was too small a thing for Jesus just to be the King of the Jews. No, but for the Greek and the Romans who spoke the Latin and the Greek, and even for Australians like you and I who speak English. No, this was no unfortunate accident. This was God's plan to crown his king. So let me ask you again, why are you here today? It's no accident that you're here. You're here because it's God's plan for you to hear this today, to know that Jesus was that innocent king. That was God's plan, for you to be here, to know that, so that you would accept Jesus as your suffering king who dies for you. Just like God took their wrong and used it for his right, so God is taking all your wrong, giving it to King Jesus to die, that on the cross you are given all his right with him. That's why you're here, because God's plan is for you to trust King Jesus. Maybe for the first time today, maybe for the 100th time. But before you can do that with real certainty and conviction, you've got to know. You've got to know one thing. Did it really happen? And that's our second point. Did it really happen? A few years ago, there was a survey carried out that found that 4 in 10 people don't believe that Jesus was a real person, which, as we'll see, is surprising given what the historians say, but more surprising is that 57% of those people still called themselves Christians. Now, of course, not all of those people would have been the same, but certainly there would be many who call themselves Christians today but don't believe or aren't sure if Jesus was a real person in history. But actually, it really matters if Jesus was real. You see, if Jesus really is who he says he is, and he offers what he says he offers you, then this is the best news you've ever heard. But it all hinges on, did this really happen? I mean, fairy tales are nice, don't get me wrong, but you don't bet your life on a fairy tale, do you? So, did it really happen? Was Jesus real, and did he really die on the cross all those years ago? Well, what we just had read for us before was one of the eyewitness accounts of Jesus' crucifixion. One of his closest friends, John. He's the man in verse 35, the man who saw it and has given his testimony. But before we look more closely at what John says, what do the historical experts say? Let's have a guess. If 4 out of 10 punters, regular folk like us, think that Jesus wasn't real, what do you think the historical experts say? What do you think the people who know? They've looked at all the different evidence and historical facts. Do you think it would be more like 6 out of 10 historians don't think that Jesus was real or crucified? Or more like 8 out of 10 historians don't? Or perhaps less, like maybe only 1 in 10 historians? Well, I did what you do nowadays, and I asked one of those chat bots on the internet, the Bing one. I asked the chatbot, how many historians think that Jesus was real? And the chatbot said something like this, excuse my robot voice. Contemporary scholars of antiquity agree that Jesus existed, and biblical scholars and classical historians view the theories of his non-existence as effectively refuted. Wow, did you get that? Chatbot says that the historians all seem to believe that he is true, that he really existed. Okay, so I asked the chatbot again, what about Jesus dying on the cross? How many historians didn't think that happened? And the chatbot said, I'm sorry, I can't find any scholars who deny that Jesus died on the cross. In fact, virtually all scholars of antiquity accept that Jesus was a historical figure and that he was crucified. Would you like me to look up more information on the topic? But we can't just believe what the robots say, right? What do the historians themselves say? Well, Dr. Bart Ehrman, in a 2011 review of the state of modern scholarship, he wrote that that's Jesus, certainly existed, as virtually every competent scholar of antiquity, Christian or non-Christian, agrees. Therefore, it's safe to say that there is a scholarly consensus. Jesus was a historical figure and he really did die on the cross. So what did you guess? Did you guess 8 out of 10 historians wouldn't think he was real? 4 out of 10? Well, it looks like it's not 1 out of 10. It's not even 1 out of 100 historians think Jesus wasn't real or really died. In fact, and I am pressing the point here, but Dr. John Dixon, he's a historian and a Christian. He made a cheeky bet on Twitter back in 2014. He said, I'll eat a page out of my Bible if someone can find a full professor of ancient history, classics, or New Testament in any real university in the world who argues that Jesus never lived. And let me assure you, his Bible has been safely off the menu for all those years. So what does John record for us? Have a look, verse 31. Now on the day of preparation, the next day was to be a special Sabbath, because the Jewish leaders did not want the bodies left on the crosses during the Sabbath. And they asked Pilate to have the legs broken and the bodies taken down. You see, all of this was happening during Passover, the most special time of the year for the Jews. It's when they remember being saved out of slavery in Egypt. But God will now save out of slavery to sin. And likely the leaders had Deuteronomy 21 in their mind that says anyone put to death on a tree or an upright bit of timber was cursed by God, but that you had to get them down before night. So they asked something that sounds a bit strange to us, but they asked for the legs to be broken. And that seems a bit cruel to us, doesn't it? I mean, you're already killing them. Why would you break their legs? But the whole point of crucifixion is to draw out someone's death, to make it go all day and night. And sometimes it's to make a public, shameful show of someone. It's the Romans saying, look how powerful we are. We did this to your king, and we can do it to you too. But by breaking the person's legs, often with a large iron mallet, they can no longer hold themselves up to breathe. And so they basically suffocate or breathe to death, bleed to death. The leaders are basically saying here, come on, let's hurry this along. And so in verse 32, the soldiers therefore, they came and broke the legs of the first man who'd been crucified with Jesus, and then those of the other, But when they came to Jesus and found that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. So instead, to prove the point, the soldiers pierce him in the side, and blood and water, which is likely the clear interstitial fluid that accumulates on death, comes out. Now remember that piercing of the side, that will come up again on Sunday. Also, John points out here that Jesus was in control. He had even planned this. See verse 36 and 37. The Old Testament said that he was going to be pierced in his side, that they wouldn't break any of his bones. Remember, this is Jesus' coronation as king, and it's more closely planned than Queen Elizabeth's coronation. And so finally, John says in 35, the man who saw it has given testimony, and his testimony is true. He knows that he tells the truth, and he testifies so that you also may believe. John saw it. He passed it on at great personal cost. John ends up in prison for this. Why does he do it? So that you can believe. Now, yes, John's biased. He's one of Jesus' best friends. We even see Jesus asked him to look after his mother once he's gone in verse 26 and 27. But John knew Jesus well, and he still thought that Jesus really was the king he claimed to be. I wonder if you told your best friends that you were the king of the universe. I wonder what your best friends would think of you. But even Jesus' best friends, when they hear that, knowing his life, believe him. So we've seen that it's possible to believe. In fact, it's widely accepted historically that Jesus did die, and John's eyewitness testimony is part of that. So again, why are you here today? It really happened. But the important question is why? And that's part of the reason of why you're here today. You're here to decide what to do with that fact that Jesus died on the cross. What are you going to do with it? How does it affect you? Our final point, what does it mean for you? The wonderful swap. Finally, we see what Jesus' death means for us. It's a wonderful swap. We give Jesus our sin, what we deserve for our wrong, and he takes it and what we deserve on the cross. And instead, he gives us his spotless record. So death and judgment and what lies beyond death, we will be found not guilty. It is finished for us. We are free. After all, the death of someone long ago, can it really mean something for you today? Well, it's no small thing to kill a king. Remember at the start, I told you about another man in history who was executed in England in 1649. Well, that man who was executed in 1649 was King Charles I. Yes, that's right, our current king, King Charles III, but this was King Charles I. He was tried for treason and executed. But how does his death so long ago mean something for you today? Well, Charles was tried and found guilty by the Parliament of the day for wanting the king to have an absolute, unquestionable power, which meant that everyone would live in fear of the king, that he would come and take your things, that he would put you to death. But the Parliament, they weren't having that. So remember, it's no small thing to kill a king. So what does it mean for you today? It means that our monarchs are not given absolute power. And so for Charles III, our current king, whether you love him, hate him, don't really care about him, one thing you never have to do is fear him. You never have to fear that he has absolute power, that he'll come and take your stuff. That death so long ago still has meaning for you today. But what about Jesus' death? What does it mean for you today? He's the strange king who dies for you. He uses his absolute power not for himself but for you. And it means that you will never have to fear what lies beyond death. You never need fear God's judgment for the wrong you've done. See what John records for us in verse 28. Later, knowing that everything had now been fulfilled and finished, so that the scripture was fulfilled, Jesus said, I am thirsty. A jar of wine vinegar was there. They soaked it in a sponge. They put the sponge on a stalk of a hyssop plant, and they lifted it to Jesus' lips. And when he had received the drink, Jesus said, "It is finished." With that, he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. Finished, fulfilled. It's finished, Jesus says. What's finished? What he came to do, the plan, which was to lay down his life for his friends. Here's one of those false beliefs that people have about Jesus. They say, yes, I believe that Jesus died on the cross, but it was kind of more just an example of love for us, to show how much he cares for us, not to actually pay for our wrong. People say to themselves, well, I've got to make up for myself. I've got to make up for my wrong. This is the false belief that we have to do more good than the bad to kind of, get enough brownie points with God to make him happy. In fact, someone at church was telling me the other day that one of their workmates, they were talking to them and they were saying, oh, what are you going to do over Easter? I'm going to go to church. Oh, me too, they said. Yet they said, yeah, and by going to church this Easter, we'll earn some brownie points with the guy upstairs. That somehow by coming to church you can earn enough brownie points to make up for the wrong things that you've done. It's a common misconception. But just to be clear, we don't earn points, a brownie or otherwise, to get in God's good books. If such a thing were possible, then why would Jesus have to die, right? In fact, before going to the cross, Jesus prays, Father, if there's any other way, but there wasn't. On the cross, Jesus experiences God's judgment for you. He's cursed so that you can be blessed. He's judged for the wrong we've done. I mean, we all want to get justice, right? We all hate it when the evildoer gets away, and God says he will bring perfect justice. But that justice includes you and me, right? So either we can face our judgment after we die, or Jesus faces it for us on the cross. And we swap. We give Jesus all the wrong we've done, and he gives us all his right. We give him our checkered record, and he gives us his perfect record. It's a swap. And I tell you what, it's the best deal around. Because when we die and stand before God in judgment, when we stand before God after we've died and God asks you to explain your life and everything you've done, and before, the excuses start pouring out of your mouth, Jesus comes up beside you, puts his arm around you and says, she's with me, he's with me. I died for his sins, her sins on that cross all those years ago. And that's why our King Jesus, when he dies, he says, what does he say? It is kind of paid for. It's kind of paid for. You need to earn enough brownie points and you'll be right. Is that what he says? No. It is a really good example for you to follow. So now, keep your nose clean and be nice to people. No. What does he say? It is finished. He takes our punishment, God's right anger at our rebellion against him. Now we only know God's love. It is finished. You're loved by God forever. You never need fear what comes after death again. So I've been asking that question, why are you here today? We've heard that Jesus is the innocent king who dies according to the plan, that it really happened, and you've got to decide what you're going to do with it. Will you accept Jesus' offer to die the death you deserve? Let me encourage you to take that offer. Jesus, your kind king. If you've never accepted that or believed in Jesus before, we've been seeing that believing in Jesus, it isn't a blind stab in the dark, it's a swap. It's a saying, yes, please, Jesus. And if you haven't already done that, please take the time to do that today. And if you've already done it, let's be thankful. If you want to know more about Christianity, we'll be running a course later in the year called Christianity Explored, where we look more at who Jesus is and what he claims. We also have this book, Is Easter Unbelievable, by Rebecca McLaughlin. She has a PhD from Oxford University. She investigates Easter. Please, they're free. They're our gift to you. They're on the table. Please take one of those on your way out if you'd like to investigate Easter further, or if you know someone who will. And also, come back on Sunday, and we'll look again at what happened after Good Friday on Resurrection Sunday. You see, Jesus doesn't stay dead, and neither will we. Let's pray.